Anyway, let's go ahead and get this going because we have very limited time here. My name is Will Castens, and I am going to be acting as the MC, I guess, of Maryland United for Peace and Justice. And we want to welcome Representative John Sarbanes, who will be talking to us today about House of Representatives Bill HR 1, which is quite a large and complex bill that introduces many reforms into our election system and other elements of democracy. It's very far-reaching, and I guess I will let Representative Sarbanes himself try to summarize those in there. He is the representative for Maryland House District number 3, which is kind of right in the middle of the state of Maryland, and has been described by many as looking like a pterodactyl. Is often one of the examples toted out for extreme gerrymandering, and I think that is one of the things that HR 1 would be addressing. So without any further ado, actually, before handing this over, I just want to ask everybody a couple of things. And number one is, I think it's already, where pretty much everybody except for me is muted right now, but I think that Bahram has made it so that people can unmute themselves. If you are unmuted for asking a question or something like that, please remember to mute yourself afterwards, because environmental noises can really make it annoying for everybody else to hear. And I would like to ask everybody to reserve the chat function for submitting questions to Representative Sarbanes on there, not for just doing idle chatting or rebutting what he might be saying, etc., like that. Okay. And after that, I think let's go ahead and hand it off to Representative Sarbanes. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Will. I appreciate it. And great to be with Maryland United for Peace and Justice. Thank you for your good work, and thank you for your interest in HR 1, the For the People Act. I'm going to try and be as brief as I can on the front end while giving you some understanding of the bill and its importance so that we can get to some questions. I've been working on this issue of democracy reform from the day I showed up in Congress almost 15 years ago. I was elected back in 2006. And the reason was when I arrived and I wanted to start working on all the things I cared about, gun safety, lowering the cost of prescription drugs, environmental issues, I soon discovered how much undue influence, money and a rigged system was having on our ability to make progress on those things and other important issues that I care about and the public cares about. So I really made a study of this. What can we do to make sure that people's voices are truly respected in our politics, that when we get to Washington, we actually carry out the will of the people and don't get kind of taken hostage by the special interests and the insiders and the lobbyists and do their bidding, instead of doing what needs to be done for the broad public interest. And as a result of that keen interest, I began talking with my colleagues, and about 3 years ago, I guess, was asked by the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, to head up the Democracy Reform Task Force and to begin assembling these really terrific proposals that could address grievances that people are feeling about their democracy and how it operates. And that's what we did. HR 1 is that blueprint. It's the result of pulling in the best ideas about how we could really fix a broken political system and make sure that government, as James Madison aspired it to be, is dependent on the people alone and is not dependent on these big money forces that operate in our society. So that became the project. And the good news is that we had this proposal put together just in time, it seemed, for the arrival of a team of reformers that came to the House of Representatives in 2018. They came off the campaign trail where they had spoken to some of the very angry and dispirited and cynical audiences that, frankly, Donald Trump found in 2016. And he exploited that cynicism, I think, for his own personal advancement. But we had a team of reformers that found that same anger and said, hey, instead of sending someone to Washington who will kind of burn it to the ground and break all the furniture, how about we'll go and we'll try to restore your voice and fix what's broken and put you back at the center of your own democracy. That message worked, but it came with the understanding that if you do get the gavel, you need to deliver. And that's why in March of 2019, within the first 100 days of the 116th Congress, we passed H.R. 1 in the House. Of course, Mitch McConnell wasn't going to let it see the light of day in the Senate. But here we are again. And I'm hoping that next Wednesday we will pass H.R. 1 in the House again, with every Democrat co-sponsoring it. And now we have a different opportunity. We have a president in the White House who will sign this bill if it can get to his desk. And we have a Democratic Senate, the slimmest of margins. But that gives us a new opportunity. And I'm sure we'll talk about how the math operates over there in the rest of this call when we get to Q&A. Before I stop, briefly, here's what's in the bill. And I kind of think about it in terms of responding to that concern out there in the country, that anxiety. I mean, you know, Americans, I give them credit. In November, they fought their way to the ballot box and they pulled the democracy back from the brink. But what they pulled back is still very fragile. That was the lesson of January 6th, among other things, in the attack on the Capitol. And so we really need to give our democracy care and attention and strengthening. I think that's what H.R. 1 does. So the first thing we've been hearing from people for a long, long time is, why do I have to run an obstacle course to get to the ballot box every 2 years? It's crazy. It's been 50 years since John Lewis shed blood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, marching for the right to vote. And still the United States of America isn't anywhere near a gold standard among our peer nations when it comes to just that basic access to the franchise. So we have a whole set of reforms in H.R. 1. Most of them, I will tell you, authored by John Lewis, who for 5 Congresses in a row introduced a bill that we made Title I of H.R. 1. Automatic voter registration nationwide, same-day registration, 15 days of early voting everywhere in the country, no excuse absentee ballot voting, severe penalties for voter suppression, voter intimidation, voter caging, voter purging, use of ID laws to disenfranchise people when they show up at the polls. All of this is part of H.R. 1. Second thing we heard from people is, don't just respect the vote, respect the voter. So let's do something about partisan gerrymandering in America. It's crazy that politicians choose their voters instead of the other way around. So we have provisions in this bill that would create independent redistricting commissions in every state in the country. It would be a more objective and fair process. It would mean that the composition of the House of Representatives truly reflects the vote that's being cast out there in the country, which is not the case now. There's a big gap between what the voters do on election day and who actually shows up in Washington because of partisan gerrymandering. So that was something we wanted to respond to. Next thing we heard from people is, we're really worried about foreign actors hacking into our elections, where the lack of transparency on these digital platforms in terms of political ads and other disinformation that's being spread. So what can you do to strengthen that? So we have a whole set of provisions to make our election infrastructure more robust, protect against foreign interference, insist on digital ad transparency, and other measures. Next item, when you go to Washington, please behave yourselves. You would think this is a pretty minimum standard to meet, but the public sees a lot of lapses when it comes to ethics and accountability and transparency. So we have a whole set of reforms to increase confidence there. Code of ethics for the executive branch, for members of Congress, for the judicial branch, closing loopholes, making sure lobbyists are having to raise their hand when they're on Capitol Hill, so we know who they are, how they're getting paid, and what kind of money is flowing. All of these kinds of things. A requirement that presidents have to release their tax returns. So that would be put into law statutorily. The next thing we heard from people is when you get to Washington, please don't get tangled up in the money. And this is the thing I've been most focused on, to be honest, because I think it's responsible for this sense of this cynicism that's been so corrosive, because people feel like if I get to the ballot box, I send you to Washington, and you get sort of taken hostage by the big money crowd, then my voice doesn't matter still. And we've got a whole set of provisions in there. We fixed the Federal Election Commission, which is the agency that should be blowing the whistle in the last 6 months of any election when the big money crowd is up to mischief and saying you're crossing the lines and we're calling you out. But they can't do that now because they're paralyzed, they're dysfunctional. We fixed that agency. We put in standards of transparency so we know where the secret money and the PAC money is coming from, which has so demoralized Americans since the Citizens United case. And this is my favorite in some ways, we create a small donor matching system to fund congressional campaigns and presidential campaigns, modeled closely after things we're seeing around the country, including in some jurisdictions in the state of Maryland. But the idea here is twofold. One is it empowers everyday Americans, small donors. They start to feel like they own the way campaigns are funded instead of it being the corporations and insiders and the big money crowd. But the other thing is experience at the state and local level has shown that when you create a system like this, it makes it more possible for people who can't get into politics and win and be competitive to do that. Because right now, to be successful, particularly for a congressional campaign where it costs on average $1.8 million every 2 years to run a winning campaign, if you don't know people with a lot of money or have a lot of money yourself, you simply cannot compete. But if you have these systems where you can collect small donations, earn a 6-to-1 match on that, you can be competitive. And what we've seen at the state and local level is it increases the diversity, the gender diversity, the racial diversity, the socioeconomic diversity of the candidate pool. And then the result is the people that get elected and go serve are more diverse and representative of the country as a whole. We need to bring that to Washington. We need to bring it to federal campaigns. So that's a key element. So those are the things. Let us get to the ballot box. Behave yourselves. Don't get tangled up in the money. Do what's right for the democracy and for the people. And that's all embodied in this bill, H.R. 1, the For the People Act. And it's now also been designated as S1 on the Senate side. So it's H.R. 1, S1. We hope to get it passed next week and then push forward and create this new reality. At a moment, and I'll have to close with this, and then I'd love to hear questions. At a moment, sadly, when the other side is going in the opposite direction. The Brennan Center released a report that they keep updating because they have to every week that showed that within the first 4 weeks of this year, or 6 weeks of the year, over 250 bills have been introduced by Republican state legislators across the country to roll back voting, access to the ballot box, etc. Exhibit A, Georgia. They want to get rid of no excuse absentee ballot voting. They want to eliminate early voting, but just on Sundays. Gee, I wonder why that is. Maybe it's because there's like a really massive Souls to the Polls program in Georgia. I mean, it's blatant. And this is happening everywhere across the country. So the plus minus on H.R. 1 is not just doing good things and increasing access against the backdrop of like a neutral scenario. It's actually trying to accomplish that at a time when the other side has learned the lesson from their defeat in this last election. Not we need to have better ideas, but rather we need to figure out new ways to manipulate the electorate and diminish the audience that we're accountable to. So they're going in the wrong direction. We're trying to move things in the positive direction. And we're asking everybody who cares about democracy, obviously that's everybody on this call, and I think most Americans, obviously, to lean in now, raise the temperature, demand that H.R. 1, S1 get over the finish line. The stakes could not be higher. I wish I was overstating the case here, but I'm not. So thanks for your interest, and I will stop now and answer a few questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that summary, Representative Sarbanes. Okay, for taking questions here, you can do it two ways. Number one is you can use your chat function and then type it in and we will see it. Or you can raise your hand. And the way you do that is by going down to your reactions button right there. And the raise hand, I just want to note, is different from the clapping hand sign. So the raise hand is actually at the one at the bottom right there. And as the MC, I'm going to pull rank here a little bit and ask the first question. And my first question to you is, okay, if we do get to reform and stop this extreme amount of gerrymandering, given the fact that your own district is extremely gerrymandered as it is right there, isn't that mean that you're going to be putting, well, yourself on the line right there for, I mean, as far as I know right there, you're only being in a safe seat because of the extreme gerrymandering. I don't know that for sure, but it might be. But on the other hand, a little bit more broadly for the state of Maryland, it's pretty clear if we did not have gerrymandering, there would be at least a second Republican representative in the House. So it looks to me like your proposed reforms right here could have a negative effect on you and your party, at least here in the state of Maryland. So how do you respond?
Well, I mean, we have to do what's fair. And I think the key here has always been that if we were going to reform how redistricting is done, it had to be done across the country. You can't just fix things in one state and leave them unattended in other places, because frankly, that increases the political distortion of things. So the goal here is reform across the country. Maryland would be subject to the same standards as every other state, and then you let the chips fall where they may. You have a more independent process. Now, to be fair to Maryland, while there is gerrymandering in Maryland, like happens in a lot of places, it's not the hyper extreme partisan gerrymandering you've seen in other places, because Maryland is a pretty democratic state. So you would expect to see a lot of Democratic seats, maybe not 7-1, maybe 6-2. We'll see where it lands. But we have states like North Carolina, Ohio, Texas, Florida, where the state is not anywhere near as, in those cases, Republican as you would judge it to be by the members of Congress who are elected and serve. And that's because the lines have been drawn in a very hyper partisan way. But yeah, this has to be a fair process. And I think at the end of the day, that will increase people's confidence in the way the whole system operates. And that's our goal here.
Oh, Congressman, this is Tony Langman. I'm just on the phone. You can't see me. I'm a convener of Maryland United for Peace and Justice. I'm very glad to hear that the bill includes fixing the Federal Election Commission because, as you said, it's been absent during the most needed times of regulating elections. And so I'd like to know what the bill says about the Federal Election Commission. And one other question. I think there's something in the bill about assisting people with disabilities to vote. Yes. And I'd like to know about that. So.
Yeah. Yeah, there are provisions in the bill that try to create the right accommodations for many, many different categories of voters, including voters with disabilities. And we've worked closely with the National Disability Rights Network and other groups to try to sort of thread the needle in terms of what represents maximum access there, at the same time as you're imposing a set of standards and, you know, paper ballots and all this other kind of stuff that you want to do. And that's an ongoing process, by the way, because people's experience at the polls evolves over time, and you want to keep making sure you're doing what represents best practices. And we're certainly doing that with the National Disability Rights community. So I appreciate your question there. With respect to, what was the other question?
About the Federal Election
Oh,
Commission.
yeah. So FEC, the reason it doesn't work right now is it's basically gridlocked because it's a 3-3 commissioner system. And what the Republicans have done over the last few years is they've taken advantage of that gridlock to basically not take any cases or take any meaningful action when these complaints are brought forward. So among the revisions to the FEC are to make it a 5-member board. Now you could say, well, that could subject it to sort of partisanship depending on who's in charge and making the appointments. But there's a pretty careful process of how the commissioners would be selected, how they're vetted, how you guard against that kind of extreme partisanship creeping in on one side or the other, and get back to where the commission can actually function in a responsible way. What's happened is a lot of these big money groups, particularly the secret and dark money groups, have learned over the last few years that they got nothing to be afraid of. And so they can pull all this mischief and these tactics, particularly down the home stretch, on the theory that even if they do get caught, that it won't happen until well after the election. So if they can get power by these maneuvers, then they just look at it as a cost of doing business if they get slapped on the other side of it. We need a commission that can be a cop on the beat in real time when it matters, so that if a complaint comes forward and says, hey, this super PAC is not behaving properly, they're violating the law, you can shut them down and stop that behavior while the election's still happening, and it matters and it has consequence. So that's a really critical reform, and one that we wanted to make sure was included right from the beginning.
Thank you.
Okay, Art Milholland, I see your hand is up. Why don't you ask?
Congressman, thank you for being here.
Yeah.
One of the reasons people feel that they're not being represented in Congress or in the nation's policies is that we're not being represented in the nation's policies. Year after year, when you poll American people, they're pretty clear across the board on what kinds of things they really want. And they really do want clean air and clean water and safe schools and safe neighborhoods. They really do want people not to have military weapons in the hands of thousands and thousands of people. They really do want not to have sanctions on Cuba and Iran, where they're causing exacerbation of COVID, for example, in Iran and other countries. And of course, sanctions are classically a form of declaration of war. They really do want to have national health insurance. They really do want not to spend $740 billion, really $1 trillion or more, on the military. They really want that money spent on schools and public parks and services for people. They really do want Lockheed not to have 1,000 lobbyists in Washington, D.C., whether they raise their hand or not. We can't afford to have that number of lobbyists there to compete with them. Ditto for the healthcare industry, et cetera. So do you really think that this HR 1 can help begin to have the public find out that it's represented and we don't get a massive tax bill like Bush put through and Obama made permanent? And then when Trump put the latest tax bill through, it was massively obvious that the public didn't want that, but we got it anyway. So that's the kind of,
Yeah.
Again,
Well, yeah, I couldn't have said it
sounds
better.
like a good start to get Americans represented. I hope it is. Do you really think we're going to address those kinds of problems?
I do. And you just outlined the original motivation for me to embrace this effort. I mean, I've kind of made it my life's work, at least for the last 15 years. And it's because all the things that you just described keep getting blocked by the influence that the money has on the system. And I'll also mention that we designed this bill with all of these components because the public was smart enough to say to us, if you don't fix all these things, then you haven't solved the problem. If you create fair elections, but when people show up in Washington who've been elected, they end up answering to the big money because that's how you gotta survive and run your campaigns, then you haven't put everyday Americans at the center of the democracy. You've just tricked us one more time. And that's where a lot of the cynicism comes from. So I do think it can make a huge difference, particularly this reform that has to do with small donor matching system. Because the fact of the matter is, it's human nature. If you get a lot of money from sources that have a particular insider agenda, then you're going to lean towards those sources, those influences, those interests when it comes time to make policy. You may not even do it consciously. Sometimes that happens. But a lot of times, again, it's just human nature. Your survival depends on being particularly attentive to one group. Then when policy comes along that helps that group, you'll probably lean that way, even if it doesn't help the broad public. And this is why we get this disjuncture between what the public wants, what the public's will is, and what's actually being delivered in Washington, which then produces the cynicism. If the pharmaceutical industry wasn't the source of so much campaign money and didn't have so many lobbyists on Capitol Hill, it would make it a lot easier for us to get the cost of prescription drugs lowered. If the gun lobby didn't have so much influence through its donations and its sort of money apparatus, we could get basic common sense gun safety rules in place in this country. We know that over 90% of Americans want universal background checks, but for some reason we can't get it done. It's not a mystery, right? If we wanted to have tax policy that actually benefited the broad public instead of what we saw 5 years ago with the tax scam that was put through that gave 83% of the benefits to corporations and wealthy people. You need to change the system so people aren't so dependent on Wall Street. And that case study is an easy one because you had Republican members saying they were getting calls from their donors and being told, if you do not pass this bill, you will not get another dime from us. The day after that bill was passed, Paul Ryan's Political Action Committee got a $500,000 check sent to him from the Koch brothers. That's called payment on delivery. This is what's going on in our democracy. And definitely when it comes to the environment, we haven't been able to make progress on climate change or deal with these toxic chemicals that are flowing through our commerce and through our bodies because that industry, the oil and gas industry, the chemical industry, with all their lobbyists and their money, have too much influence on the system. We need to break free of that dependence. I think this bill will help immeasurably in achieving that. And along with the disclosure requirements, the ethics reforms, and expanding access to the ballot box, it could really be transformative for our democracy in this very, very critical moment. I think I have time for one more question, and then
and I want to make sure that we get in some of the questions that were submitted through the chat. So here's one from Steve Harrow. Was the original group that fashioned some of the major aspects of the bill a bipartisan or nonpartisan group? And are there Republican allies, even if not necessarily co-sponsors, for your bill right now?
So the answer is there's many parts of this bill that originated with bipartisan support. In fact, we incorporated bills that were bipartisan in their original sponsorship. Secondly, there have been 2 polls released just in the last couple of weeks that show strong support for the bill across the political spectrum, very high among Democrats, but strong majorities among independents and Republicans as well. There's nothing really controversial in this bill. It's all stuff people have been asking for a long time, regardless of where they are politically or where they live in the country, suburban, urban, rural, etc. The challenge is, sadly, that the leadership of the Republican Party has decided to weigh in and essentially decree to the rank and file members that you shall stay away from HR 1, unfortunately. So this has got to come out of the Democratic corner, and I think we can be successful. I also think, frankly, it'll end up making the Republican Party a better party and act more responsible themselves, because right now they're able to manipulate the political town square in ways that mean they're not accountable for their ideas. They just kind of limit the audience that they have to speak to. But if we broaden out the audience that you have to speak to, then they're going to have to go in on the basis of their ideas, not by manipulating with voter suppression and partisan gerrymandering and using big money to spread disinformation. So it'll be good for the democracy. It'll be good for a responsible two-party system. Sadly, I don't think we're going to get a lot of Republicans voting for this bill because, as I say, I think Democrats are the ones that are going to have to break the fever here. But once we get these reforms in place, I think it'll have wide benefit across the political spectrum, and we're certainly looking forward to that. And obviously, we welcome any support from any Republican lawmaker, either in the House or the Senate, who wants to join this effort.
And speaking of that, what is the likelihood that S1 will pass in the Senate?
Well, if we have the filibuster rule in place, the likelihood is 0. But I think there's starting to be a lot of re-examination of the filibuster. I don't pretend to be a rules on this expert on the Senate rules, but I think the appetite for broad democracy reform is beginning to merge with the appetite around filibuster reform. Now, what that exactly looks like, I don't know. There's a lot of ways you can skin a cat. I do think there's a strong argument, you're hearing it every day, that if there's one place where you shouldn't require a supermajority vote, i.e. you should just have a simple majority vote, it should be with respect to legislation that's trying to restore majority rule in America. So if there's any place where you would argue that a simple majority, 51 votes, should determine the outcome of legislation, it should be with respect to a package of democracy reforms like what we've put together. Now, again, I'm not an expert on those rules, but the case for that, I think, is strengthening every day. And let me put a fine point on it. The United States Senate was delivered to Democrats by 2 runoff elections that happened on the same day in the same state. That was the state of Georgia, which is the state that John Lewis represented in the United States Congress. And the first 300 pages of HR 1 are John Lewis's bill. So you figure it out. It makes sense to go get this done. And we're just going to keep telling that story and hope we get it over the finish line.
Okay, and then here's another question that was submitted by the chat. I'll just add a little bit here, and that is, I think the Constitution specifies that each state shall run their own elections, and they have the right to determine themselves how they distribute their representatives on there. And it seems like your bill HR 1 is going to be fairly highly prescriptive on how they should be doing that. So here's the thing: is there going to be any kind of problem with having this run, being constitutional and being ruled on by the Supreme Court?
Great question. We're very confident that every dimension of this bill passes constitutional muster. You're right that states can govern how they run their own elections. But the time, place, and manner clause of the United States Constitution gives Congress the authority to regulate and determine how federal elections are conducted in all the states. So a lot of these baseline best practice standards we're putting in place on access to the ballot box, et cetera, are ones that would govern federal elections. But as a practical matter, a state isn't going to set up 2 completely different systems for registering people, for early voting, for absentee ballot voting. So if they've got to have those measures in place for federal elections, which we have absolute clear authority to do under the Constitution, that is going to leverage those best practices across all of the voting apparatus in these states. There's still very much that states can tailor and customize to meet these baseline standards. So it's not like you're really taking significant authority in that regard away from the states. You're just establishing some baseline standards here to get to what I would say is that gold standard of what voting in America should look like. And again, with the redistricting, that's with respect to congressional redistricting, again, where we have authority. But once you get those commissions in place, the public's appetite, I think, to make that the sort of standard and practice across all redistricting in the particular states, I think will be pretty strong. I'm gonna have to take one more question and then I've got to.
Okay. And I'll give that last question to Bill Orleans.
Okay.
Bill, can you please unmute yourself?
I think I'm unmuted, am I not?
You are. Go ahead.
To what extent would it be to what extent does HR1 include any provisions for regulating the amount of money that can be contributed by either individuals or corporations or independent political activity committees?
Great question. So the voluntary system of small donor matching that we set up is one where if you agree to participate in it, you're also agreeing to limit the kinds of donations you receive. You can't get traditional PAC donations. You can't get donations over $1,000, et cetera. We are not able, because of the Citizens United case, to regulate the amount of money that can be spent by independent actors in our politics or otherwise regulate what the Supreme Court decided in that case is political speech. However, because you need a constitutional amendment to do that. And that's a tricky process. As you know, you need 2/3 of the House, the Senate, you need 3/4 of state legislatures. It can take a long time. Now, I support the constitutional amendment because I think that Citizens United case is outrageous. We've got to do something about it. But in the meantime, what we can do in HR1 is increase a lot of disclosure and transparency of how that big money flows, which we've seen can have a deterrent effect on it when you look at what's been done in certain states across the country. We can strengthen the Federal Election Commission. We can lift up the voices of everyday Americans through that small donor matching system that I talked about. And we do include, by the way, in HR1, what we call findings language, which is a statement of support for fixing the Citizens United case and having a constitutional amendment. So we put power behind that effort, as we do, by the way, with findings language that says that we also support upgrading and restoring the Voting Rights Act. That's HR 4. It's on its own track, but that's very important. That's the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And we also make a strong statement in the bill about the importance of DC statehood. So all of these things that are about lifting up people's voices, we've included inside the architecture of HR1 in a meaningful way. And I think this could really change the equation as we go forward. And again, put Americans back at the center of their democracy. Will this mean the day after we pass HR1, or even 5 years later, that suddenly everybody loves our politics and has absolute faith and confidence and trust in how government operates? No, it's a long path back, or to a place we've never been even. But I think this would be a huge step forward, and it would make people feel like they matter again in their own democracy. Couldn't come at a more important moment. And the polls show us that the desire to see this change is not the exclusive province of any particular political party or political affiliation. This goes across the board. People just want to be able to vote and have trust that the people they send to Washington, to the State House, wherever it is, are there to act on their behalf. And that's what we're trying to do with HR1. So I appreciate the interest. The ways that you can help us now are to just, in a sense, spread the good word on this, spread the gospel of HR1 and what it offers. Because the more people learn about the bill, the more excited they get about it and the more supportive they are. If your members of Congress, and in Maryland it's certainly the case, are supporting the bill with one exception, notable exception, please tell them that you are excited about their support and, put as much behind that as you can, because, we haven't gotten it done yet. We've got to get it over the finish line, not just in the House, but ultimately. So the more members of Congress and lawmakers feel the public's desire to see this happen, the more we create the new reality and inevitability behind this effort. There is a group called the Declaration for American Democracy. If you look that up, the Declaration for American Democracy, DFAD, it's a broad coalition of over 150 organizations that operate in the environmental space, faith, labor, good government, gun safety, consumer protection. They've all come together to get back to the question we had a moment ago, because they've appreciated that the progress on their issues depends on us fixing the basic rules of our democracy. And the Declaration for American Democracy has ways that you can volunteer and help and support the effort as we move forward. So I definitely appreciate your interest in this. I thank you for the invitation. Please stay in touch with us. And whoever helped to organize the call, I can't remember where it originated, but you've got my contact information and that of my staff, and we'd love to keep connected to you as we move forward with this effort.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Representative Sarbanes. We really appreciate you devoting as much time as you have for that. And yes, I think everybody else here, if you'll just stay on, we can have kind of a public forum on this. And I just want to say one thing about it, and that is it is a very large and complex bill. And probably the best place that I've seen that gives a good explanation that doesn't get too much into the weeds is the Brennan Center. So if you just do a search for HR1 bill and Brennan Center, then you'll probably get there to the Brennan Center's page where they actually have an annotated markup on that, on HR1, where it has it very nicely arrayed, so you can, and in an outline type of thing, and you can go and click on things that are of your own particular interest on that. So having said that, I guess at this point, if anybody wants to also say something or have something, toss a question out and see if any of us has an answer to it, then I would say go right ahead.
Hello?
Yep.
I wasn't going to try and take advantage of the opportunity to ask him a quick follow-up question, but it would be interesting to know, Will and the rest of us, to what extent do the provisions in HR1, which let me declare my support for, but notwithstanding that, to what extent do provisions within HR1 assure the kind of incumbent protections that exist currently without HR1, and that's without regard to party designation. Corporate givers give large amounts, and other individual givers give large amounts to both of the major parties. And